Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Marin Economic Briefing. My name is Mike Blakely, and I'm the CEO of the Marin Economic Forum. We are a nonprofit organization here in Marin County, providing research advisory on all the key economic issues here in Marin County and the Bay Area region more widely. I'd like to thank you for visiting our program this morning. As usual, there are all kinds of crazy things happening in the economy. This morning, excuse me, it was confirmed that stock market has given back all of its gains for 2023. There was somebody yesterday, an economist, that came out and predicted a certain recession in 2024. Right after that, another group of economists came out and said we have achieved a soft landing. So anybody's guess is as good as ours of what's happening at the macro level. What we like to do in these programs, though, is focus on Marin County. And we're going to be doing that today by looking at some of the key economic indicators that tell us what's going on here. And then, as usual, we'll end things with our summary of what we see going on and what we're watching. Joining me, as always, is MEF's chief economist, Dr. Rob Eiler. He's going to take us through all of the key national, local, and state level indicators. And hopefully at the end of this 30 minutes, we'll have a little bit better idea of what's happening out there than we did when we woke up this morning. Rob, good morning. Over to you.
Thanks, Mike. And thanks, folks, for coming today. So we are, as Mike said, in some intriguing times in terms of how the economy is moving forward. So what I want to do is I want to kind of show you the latest state of affairs in a couple different ways. The first one is to look at the national labor market. So I try to always compare what's happened since the pandemic to what happened during the Great Recession. This is the evolution of the Great Recession from the beginning of it in November 2007, when we started to see American jobs lost. We call that total number of employed 100 in November 2007. It took about 78 months to get back to the same aggregate number of workers. And that's why we call it the Great Recession. And here's where we are as of the latest data. Now, the new jobs data are going to come out on Friday for September, though we measure at the national level, we measure employment gains or losses basically mid-month, because we do a payroll survey and also a population survey, blend those two together and come up with what happened in a sort of air quotes that month. But 102.9 means that we're 2.9% above the total number of people working in the United States we had in January 2020, just before the pandemic. And the idea here is, as long as this number continues to grow, and it has successfully, you can kind of see that ascension at a descending rate, or a sort of slowing down, if you will, as coming up to maybe what's a current peak. As that grows, we will not have a recession declared in the United States. And I'll come back and talk about that in a minute. The next stop is prices. So we actually saw a pretty significant fall in the Federal Reserve's favorite price index for right now, which is called Core Personal Consumption Expenditures Prices. We only saw a 3.9% increase from last August to this August. And that is seen as sort of mediocre, or sort of moderately good, if you will. But you can see that how that declined since recent peaks, especially over the last 8 or 9 months. So that blue solid line is the monthly look back 12 months in terms of percentage terms in the change in this price index. And this is meant to cover everything that we buy at home except for food and energy. And that's why we call it core. So that downward movement toward those red dots, which are in those shaded areas, have now been expanded in terms of what the Federal Reserve is reporting out. They're actually looking now beyond 2025 toward 2026, which is that final dot on the far right-hand side. And the supposition through that forecast of where prices are going is, in fact, inflation will get very close to achieving the Federal Reserve's goal of the dotted line at 2% on an annualized basis by the end of 2026. So we're going to have lingering, relatively high inflation for at least probably the next couple of years, but it is declining, which is good. However, if you look back toward 2007, we had an amazing time of relatively moderate inflation. However, we paid for it in certain ways by the Great Recession and the aftermath of it. So this has got to have some consternation in policy circles for probably at least the next 18 months. But we saw a higher level in June and July, and that was sort of the beginning of thinking whether or not the Federal Reserve is going to continue to increase interest rates. They decided not to, and these price data they knew when they made the decision last month. Do we think we'll have one more rate increase? There's a lot of back and forth in this. Like Mike started with, he talked about how economists are becoming a little bit more split about whether or not we're on the precipice of recession. We actually are in the midst of a soft landing and will not recess. And sort of this game that fills a lot of TV and Twitter /X time in terms of our lives. But the bottom line is that the only reason that we should see another rate increase is if, in fact, we start to see that blue solid line curl back up in trend, or in essence, not move through those red dots in earnest. And that'll be the game that gets played over the next maybe quarter or so by the Federal Reserve. But another increase in rates also puts banks and credit unions a little bit closer to the edge in terms of the profitability of lending, how much it costs them to bring in funds, and also just puts more pinch on our own lives in terms of using credit markets. So the Federal Reserve is, though, seeking job losses. So if you combine these two graphs together, they want to see that blue line continue to fall toward the dotted line, but also the graph I just showed you, they want to see that ascending at descending rates start to curl a little bit closer to actually losing jobs or being more flat. So as I'll show you in a minute, California, for example, has had relatively flat jobs growth basically since last summer, which is in essence what the Federal Reserve wants to do at the national level and has not quite yet achieved. And without achieving those job losses, or at least some flattening in jobs growth, we won't see the sort of final downward pressure on inflation, because people are still getting, there's more people being paid, there's still more general demand on the demand side of our economy, and that will fuel a little bit more inflation pressure than the Federal Reserve wants to see. Now, Mike asked me to really quickly talk about what happens if we actually get to a government shutdown. We narrowly avoided one last weekend, and we're kind of on the precipice again. But if you look back in time, some of the basic outcomes that take place when you have a federal shutdown are you have a little bit more equity market volatility. Mike talked about that a little bit. We have a little bit more of a shock to logistics. So you can imagine if TSA doesn't have as many people at the airport, if you're already mad at what happens at the airport, it would get a lot worse when you have a federal shutdown that lasts, let's say, 2-3 weeks, and then sometimes maybe 6 or 7 weeks. It increases what's already a very uncertain time for us politically in the United States. And what that can do is it can make global investors nervous on two fronts, either financial investment, and you'll see cash walk away from the US on the margin, but you'll see less, let's say, inbound investment for businesses to grow, which might not just be secondary market activity in terms of just purchasing assets as an investor, but really making a strong investment in businesses and wanting those businesses to grow through capital investment. That's something that political uncertainty can also lead to in terms of a downturn in those flows. And the pinch here is really on lower to middle income households. So where you see the most exposure to federal shutdowns is usually where you have a large exposure to employees for the federal government that either will have a delay in pay or may in fact be furloughed. But generally speaking, historically, these are short-term bumps in the road. It's really more how it affects those areas that have relatively heavy federal government employment exposure, and also who are sort of logistics hubs. And so if you cross the bridge towards San Francisco and the greater Bay Area, the core Bay Area would see a lot more of a problem from a federal shutdown than, let's say, we would see in Marin, Sonoma, or Napa counties. Bottom line, though, is that what's this all portending? You know, what's going to happen with the federal budget as a result of all the negotiations, the sort of back dealing? Now, what we may see with Speaker McCarthy either losing the speakership or having to make some weird deal to continue it, that could lead to some strange outcomes in terms of what we thought the federal budget would be, let's say, 3 or 4 months ago, and what that might mean for President Biden's driven CHIPS Act, the Investment Recovery Act, and these other investments in the United States economy that were coming from the federal government. Are those going to be delayed? Are they going to be redirected? And what's that really mean for the movement of our economy, not now, but maybe the next 18 months? And so you're getting a little bit of those predictions of additional recession pressure, somewhat because of what we're seeing in Congress, unfortunately. One other sort of macro variable of note is this one. So the personal savings rate has been all over the place the last couple of years because of the federal government programs to give people income and basically act like a tax rebate when the pandemic began, in a second tranche in 2021. Lower interest rates also pushed savings away. And those savings have been drained primarily because of inflation over the last, let's say, 12, 15 months, and has curled back up as interest rates have continued to climb up a little bit more and more. But why I talk about the personal savings rates and why we should watch this is because it can be a gauge of what's going on with bank deposits. So not all bank deposits are held at interest, but when you see that curl back up, it tells you that people are thinking, wow, we're maybe in more uncertain times. The interest rate rising is telling me I shouldn't demand as much and I should be saving more. And that can start to slow down the economy. And in some ways, this is an indirect effect of what the Federal Reserve has been doing. and in some ways a reason why the Federal Reserve has been doing what it's doing to try to slow down demand. We want this to be rising in the longer term. So the one thing that's weird about savings rates rising is that it actually is a slower moving economy, but a better play in the long term, because not only does it stabilize home or household balance sheets, it also provides a little bit more investment capital for businesses in terms of people saving, and ultimately that generating larger ability for lenders to lend out to commercial borrowers. So that's something that is sort of this weird trade-off with savings, and we're watching how higher interest rates actually make that happen. And like I said, it's been a unbelievable roller coaster in terms of the recent history, and these data are monthly from 1988 forward, so you can see how it kind of moves through a business cycle more or less, and when savings start to pick up, the economy starts to slow down, which is classic because interest rates are usually rising right before that happens. And then you can see how crazy it's been basically since the pandemic. What a downturn in savings can do, though, is it can put more pressure on households, and thus by saving more, that's good in the long term. But some of this might be the drain in savings might be because of rising cost pressures at home. So our lower to middle income households in Marin County, they might not be able to save as much. So when you think in the aggregate, it's also thinking who actually participates in equity markets in such a way that that savings rate is something that actually affects the greater economy. But you can see that curl is maybe telling us a story that the economy is finally going to start slowing down a little bit. If we look at California, here is the evolution of the labor force in California. So some of the things that are brewing at the state level that are a macrocosm of what's been happening in Marin County, as we'll just see, and we'll see in just a minute, is the evolution of the labor force. So you can see since 2010 on a monthly basis, if you seasonally adjust the data in terms of the total number of people that are either working or potentially looking for work that we call the unemployed, it's slow, steady growth over the time after the Great Recession, the peak, a sharp cut of people walking away from the labor force at the beginning of the pandemic, doing it again when there was a second tranche and an increase in pandemic unemployment assistance, and then a kind of a final settling after all that was said and done, and then we've been growing slowly ever since. But you can see on the far right-hand side that basically since the beginning of this year, and maybe more the beginning of spring, we've seen a little bit of a curl down in those data, meaning that maybe we've reached the sort of short to medium term peak in the number of people who are going to be available for work in California. And a couple of caveats on this. One, this does count the self-employed. It does not count undocumented workers. So how much of those trade-offs actually play into a true statement of the number of people that are working or actively seeking work in California or anywhere is maybe somewhat questionable. But in the way that we officially count it, this downturn is going to be what's in front of your state legislators in terms of thinking about what that means for the California economy. And this is the number of people who are actually employed. So if you take the employed portion of the labor force and you look at its dynamics, this is how crazy it's been since the pandemic. But that flattening part, like I alluded to earlier, you can see on the far right-hand side, that orange line has much more flatness to it than does the labor force. And this is why we've seen a slow, steady expansion of unemployment in California in terms of the unemployment rate. That's the distance between those two lines, or those two curves. That flat part is exactly what the Federal Reserve wanted to see at the national level, has not quite seen, but California is sort of leading that employer change. And we knew that there were large layoffs last year. We may remember, that may seem like a long time ago, but a lot of our major tech companies in California had relatively strong layoffs. Some of that has lingered in terms of the total employment in California. So like about 20,000 jobs have been created since last year. So not very significant growth at all of jobs. And that, like I said, is really what the Federal Reserve wanted to see at the national level, hasn't quite seen yet. Here's what the two look like in Marin County. So a little bit more bumpy in the data. Some of that's because there's a little bit more agriculture, a little bit more visitor, a little bit more just teacher related employment in Marin County. So it's a little more bumpy along the way. But you can see two things. Is one, the blue line has not come back to the pre-pandemic peak, just like the state of California, but it's a little bit more significant in Marin County. Two things to think about there that also relate back to the state is one, Marin County has lost population. So how much of its population loss is focused specifically over the last couple of years on folks that were working and maybe trading folks that were working for people that are coming here not necessarily to work. That's one question that's still out there. The second part is the number of employees that live in Marin County, and the difference between this and California, only because California does not have, let's say, strong employment right over the borders. These are people that live in Marin County, just like live in California, but the dynamics of where you work are much different for a county in California, especially one that's a suburban county next to a major metropolitan area like the Bay Area is, or the core Bay Area. How much of this is driven by what happens over the bridges versus what happens in Marin County is an open question. But what it does suggest is that the number of workers that are available from Marin County's resident pool has shrunk and maybe not going to come back anytime soon. And that's changing the number of people that are working that live in Marin County. Also, perhaps because people are not only less likely to work that are living here because maybe they're retired, but because they might be working in some other place and be driven by those higher wages and higher possibilities. So those are the things, those are kind of the hypotheses as to why that's spaced and why we've not quite gotten back to the pre-pandemic level continues to exist in the post-pandemic world. Just a quick look at housing. Housing has become more optimistic in terms of the forecasting. So while the last 12 months have been a downturn in housing prices, the last 2 or 3 months have been an uptick in the 12-month looking forward forecast. A lot of that sort of driven by two ideas that kind of come full circle to Mike's original comments right off the top. One is that economists generally have become a lot more sanguine about where the economy is going. And as a result of that, the sort of brewing undercurrents of recession have faded a little bit in most housing market forecasts and have gotten a little bit more positive in terms of maybe we won't recess or have major job losses in such a way that normally lead to a lot of existing units going on market, changing supply vis-a-vis demand, and hence we see a downturn in prices. That looks like it may not be coming with strength over the next year. But these price changes, as you can see, they range from Riverside County at 5.1%, and Riverside County, just like San Bernardino, Kern, to a certain extent Santa Barbara, have seen surging prices over the last 3 years, about 50% increase in the last 3 or 4 years for each one of those places on the far left-hand side, where notice that the names of those counties on the far right-hand side are a little bit more Bay Area centric and a little bit more of a mixed bag in terms of recent outcomes. You can actually see Trinity, Humboldt, Mendocino County, sort of our North Coast counties in California, or North Coast or North Central County in terms of Trinity, are actually seeing a little bit more downward pressure on prices. So for Marin County, it's about 0.6%, but that's better than 6% down, which was the forecast about 8 months ago. And so things have gotten better. The other part of that, and so I'm sorry I took that digression. The other part, beyond the idea that we may not be going into recession, is that interest rates might start to fall in 2024 as a reaction to all the negative things that the Federal Reserve is trying to brew up in the economy, alongside of the more beneficial aspects of dropping inflation. If those job losses show up, the Federal Reserve may feel like, okay, we've now done our job and we now need to slowly reel back the recent high levels of interest rates and hope that the entire yield curve sort of gets pulled down along with it. We will see. But with that, I'll hand it back over to Mike. These are the things we're watching, and Mike and I will talk a little bit more about this in a second.
Thanks so much, Rob. As usual, just a lot of data that we are looking at and a lot of really uncertainty, which is what businesses hate. But that is the environment that we are in. There are a couple questions in the chat, and I'd like to sort of turn to those before I get to wrap up with our thoughts. So let's see if you have access to the chat, Rob.
Sure. So Don asked, as a non-economist, my sense is that much of inflation has been due to excess profit, even price gouging, rather than solely employment. What's my perspective on this? So my perspective on this is that there's no doubt about the fact that there have been cases, and especially if you look at energy prices, specifically fuel prices, that our continued consumption of gasoline alongside of the global issues with respect to geopolitics and supply chain issues we've had over the last couple of years have led to an ability to price in ways that might be a little bit more profit taking than, let's say, market driven, in the sense that when the markets move in such a way that allows you to take more profits, those businesses have taken advantage of that. There's no doubt about it. You can look at rental markets and maybe make the same case that rents have continued to slowly ascend in such ways that really are, putting our low to middle income households in more of a more jeopardy financially. The tricky part about that is that's sort of the nature of having a volatile economy. And so where do we split that out? It's probably more of the idea that inflation has been driven by a combination of forces. And what they really, and Don, this is the key, is inflation is always coming from excess demand conditions. So if we're continuing to consume and the supply chains or those that have the production of capability are able to restrict that supply, the inflation comes directly from that. So the most of the inflation over the last 2.5 years have come from sort of three major sources. One has been housing, second has been energy, and that's why the Federal Reserve likes to pull energy and food prices out because they tend to be more volatile. And the third has been the transmission of those two major centers of inflation into other supply chains or other consumption areas where basically if I'm a business and I'm facing a higher level of costs, I have to ask my customers to basically share that cost with me. So the total amount of inflation that's from that is hard to give a percentage, but at the same time, we know that there have been some excess profits out there. It's hard to fight those in a market economy, especially when it's on the move in such volatile ways that it's hard to identify what's the true genesis of maybe more medium or long-term inflation. Second question is, does the amount of new permits since the pandemic changed in the percentage of small businesses in Marin County make any difference? Or Cynthia, if you want to add a little bit to that, please do. It has grown a lot. There's no doubt about that. And in fact, that's not unique to Marin County. We've seen the number of business permits issued basically rising across the board. And some of that's been, at least the hypotheses are out there, was that you saw people who were staying home during the pandemic look at opening a new business or doing something at home that maybe they would need to sustain themselves. Part of that's just sort of the unleashing of cash that was maybe sitting on the sidelines that now is, you hang your own shingle as a consultant or something like that. It's been a real mixed bag, and it's been so volatile that it's hard to imagine, because we haven't seen a lot of, let's say, storefront openings of new businesses, that that's really indicative of anything besides people are out there thinking that I might have to have a second gig. If you see it through that angle, it suggests there's a lot of financial pressures that are maybe building under the surface. People are trying to figure out ways of generating more income, and that may be an indicator. The percentage of the so-called small businesses, of total businesses, if you define them as having, let's say, 25 employees or less, it's probably around 90% of the employers that are out there, and maybe a little higher than that in Marin County versus, let's say, California overall. But the quote unquote small business definition depends on who you ask. In some cases, it'll be 50 or less. In some cases, it'll be 500 employees or less, especially at the national level. But when I think of small business, especially in our region here north of the Golden Gate Bridge, I think of small business having 25 people or less, and that's probably somewhere in the 90% range of all the employers that are out there in terms of these three counties.
Yeah, Rob, just to jump in here,
please.
We don't get that data from the jurisdictions here, for example, to be able to tell in terms of business licenses, because they don't have to say how many employees they're going to have when they're applying for those licenses. So it's difficult. I would also even drill down a level further and say that, Marin County is largely made up of micro businesses, because over 75% of our businesses have between 1 and 4 employees. So there is no there's no organization anywhere that will say a small business is 5 people or more or less. That's a micro business, and that's mostly what we have here in Marin County. With the time we have left, let me turn to a couple of the things that we are looking at. So what's really been driving the economy, and to the surprise of many, has been the level of spending by consumers. In fact, year over year, there was a figure that came out yesterday that this year so far, spending is up by 6% over the previous year, and spending for large purchases like appliances or even vehicles is up almost 8%. And so the question that most economists are asking is, this has powered the economy. Can it keep up against this environment that Rob talked about, where we have student loan payments resuming, household savings have in fact, I was surprised to see that uptick, Rob, because we know that for the most part, pandemic savings have been exhausted or will be exhausted shortly. And then, of course, the level of interest rates, don't seem to be going down fast enough anytime soon. And then overall, what's interesting is you look at the data and you can see that, yes, inflation has come down into the 3.5% range, but there isn't anybody out there that you talk to anecdotally that will tell you they think prices have come down. And it has a lot to do with perception, like the question earlier about profit taking by companies. And so the real question here, and why this is relevant in Marin, is because we are, in fact, a consumer-driven economy ourselves. At the beginning of the pandemic, I like to use the expression that Marin's economic recovery depends on a resumption of consumption. So we know by looking at sales tax data that over the last couple of years, purchases in Marin County have gone up significantly, because from the pre-pandemic levels, sales tax revenues are up almost 7 or 8%. So clearly people are spending a lot in Marin, whether it's online shopping or whether it's, locally. The spending has been going up, but if all of a sudden some of those other factors come in to where people start keeping the cash in their pockets or in their high yield savings accounts, that could impact the Marin economy, because we are such a locally driven economy as a result to transactions. So we're really looking at that, because if we do dip into recession, or we do see a slowdown in spending, that's going to have an impact across Marin for sure. The other thing we're looking at is, Rob talked about the labor force. This continues to be an issue that if you tune into these regularly, you'll hear me talking about it a lot, because it is a problem that is not going away from Marin County. In fact, it's getting worse. Our labor force is down more now than it was at the beginning of the pandemic. And so there's nothing to suggest that those jobs are coming back, because there's nothing to suggest that the labor force is going to grow in the short term. So all of these signs that we see about people hiring, the complaints that we hear regularly from employers, and we do hear complaints here at Marin Economic Forum about what's going to happen with the employees and hiring. It seems to be an issue that we don't really know how to get ourselves out of. And even worse from our perspective, and we're trying to change this, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of cross-county collaboration, people acknowledging that this is an issue that we might need to pull people together to start solving, because again, there's nothing to suggest that our labor force is going to grow, and there's all kinds of problems if your labor force doesn't grow. So those are really the two issues that we're looking at. I think the spending issue is a little more shorter term. The labor force is not something we're going to solve overnight, but if we don't start paying attention to this, we're going to see a reduction in economic growth across Marin County, which doesn't benefit anybody. And the last point I'll make is, Rob talked about some of these impacts of a government shutdown. Hopefully we don't get there. But what Rob didn't mention was the effect that it has on benefits programs. And believe it or not, there are a lot of people in Marin County that rely on government benefits, whether it's food stamps or childcare or whatever. And if we have those things go away because of a government shutdown, that would actually have very adverse effects here as well for some of our populations. So not to be doom and gloom here, there are some strong signals that the economy has reached that soft landing, but there's always issues to look at and keep focused on that will affect us here locally. And I think that's why these are so important. So we want to thank you for tuning in this morning. We encourage you to spread the word. A recording of this will be sent later. Please pass it around. And we will be coming back to you in November with our take there, and hopefully some great news at that time on our economy. So with that, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next month.